It's great to see everyone. Welcome all of our campuses. I know Leland's right down the hall, and Newbern and all of you guys who are gathered here, as well as everybody online. I was unaware that May is National Aggressive Driving Month. Did y'all know that? No? I was trying to do my part. I would assume if we took a poll, we would all kind of agree that most people can't drive. Would y'all all agree with that? Everybody's like nodding their heads. Now, if I were to ask how many of you are good drivers, more than likely everybody would raise their hands. And this kind of is the problem. Because so the one thing I will tell you, how many of you guys have ever sat through a green light? Anybody? Just raise your hand. I want to see if I've done it. Okay, you're just focused on something, you're sitting there, and the kind people behind you didn't blow their horn at you, and you just, oh my gosh, I just sat through. Okay, so I can be that guy. I don't do it as much anymore, but I kind of recognize that I'm not a great driver. So when I drive, I am very focused on what I'm doing. And you can ask, my wife who drives with me, because I don't talk a lot because I have to focus on what I'm doing. People say, Mike, you got to ride a motorcycle. I'm like, I'd be dead on a motorcycle. I have enough trouble with four wheels, let alone two. But it's really interesting because I've been doing this for a long time. I'm thinking about this idea. A lot of us, we live like we're driving, and this is how we kind of see the world around us. I think this says a lot about us, because when people do things on the road, we are very quick to diagnose them. If they cut you off or pull out in front of you, we, all of us, are very quick to diagnose them. You know what kind of people they are. You know what kind of mama they have. You know all of their intentions. You probably know who they voted for and who they root for in sports. You got this whole scenario of what kind of person just did this to you, don't you? Don't we? And we even teach this to our kids when we're teaching them how to drive. We say, I'm not worried about you. I'm worried about what? Yeah, we don't say all the other drivers. We usually have a few adjectives to describe all the other drivers that are on the road. Dumb, blah, 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 blah. And we teach them, defensive driving, which means you can't trust anybody. And a lot of us, this is how we live. We sort of have defensive living. We've learned how to do this. We've mastered this well. And it is true there are bad drivers, and there are a lot of people who don't pay attention on the road, but that is not often what drives our intolerance of other people on the road. You know this, right? Because if you're not in a hurry and someone else is, you say things about them. If you're in a hurry and someone else isn't, you say things about them. Does this make sense? So here's the principle. The real truth is that what we believe is that people should drive like we drive. And it's actually worse than that. What we actually believe is that you should drive like I drive when I am driving like I am driving. Make sense? I need you to do what I'm doing right now because I'm in a hurry, or I'm chilling, or I'm listening to my favorite song, or whatever it is I'm doing. I need you to accommodate what I'm doing. That's how we live. And this is exactly what ends up sort of robbing us of all the things that we value as human beings, especially the things that we value as those who are created and called to bear the image of God, to reflect and to live in the way of Jesus. And one of the assumptions, the fundamental assumptions I have about people is that everybody wants me to think like them. I too want you to think like me. That's always an assumption when you enter into any conversation. When you enter into any scenario, you need to recognize that's how we treat one another. And honestly, half the time, I'd be just glad if people thought just a little bit. If you just think, you don't think like me, just think a little bit. So think about what happens and you start to pay attention. This is why I want to define these things. I want to give some definitions to what we're talking about so you can learn what it looks like to actually relate to one another, to have the relationships, to enjoy the relationships that we've been given. We often find this enormous pressure to defend ourselves whenever someone does something or says something that contradicts what we said or did. If you pull out in front of someone and they ride up on your tail, you have a reason why you pulled out in front of them. You want to defend what you have done. And then at some level, if you're yelling at them, you're demanding they understand you. Like even if they don't even care. And so there's this idea, and what it leads us to understand is that we demand, all of us almost innately demand to be understood. Also known as proving your point. We sort of carry this with us. If someone says something and disagrees with you, and you sort of, quote, agree to disagree, you'll often find yourself going back to that person and trying to reprove your point again to them. It's like we've already kind of had this discussion, we've made this decision, we're not going to do this. But, right? You've done this. Why? Because we have this need to be understood, which is a real human need. For people to understand you, for people to understand me is a real human need. What happens is we often end up demanding it, and then what we do is we project that demand on other people. We demand to be heard, to be seen, to be understood, and this mindset to feel like you have to get everybody to think like you are thinking and to understand why you think the way that you do actually prevents you from ever learning how to be empathetic and therefore robs you of real human connection, robs us of real human connection. We project this demand to be understood on other people, to be seen by other people, and therefore in that we've created this whole category that leaves us in this incredible sense or this incredible fragile foundation for our relationships. The way I drew this out last week is we said that basically the highest value in most relationships is acceptance. We use the phrase tolerance, we use all sorts of things. Acceptance. Now what I said last week, and I'll be really clear, acceptance is not the highest value that I hold in relationships. It is a value, it is the starting value. To accept someone is to see them and to accept them right where they are. To love someone is to recognize there is so much more to them and to never let another person define themselves short of what God or how God has defined them, and to never let them sell themselves short of all that God has for them and all that God has for them to do. To accept someone means you can care about them and you can love them and you can see them and you can understand them. But to love them means you want something more for them. When people talk about tolerance, I'm like, you don't want to be just tolerated. That is a miserable existence. But a lot of people live with that because acceptance is sort of the highest value that we think. Now think about this. What I think happens is, and I'm going to sort of think out loud and see if you can follow along with me. I believe that most people, if we don't live under this rule of God's love, we have the rule of God's love. And I've been here, you've heard me talk about this for years now. The way of life under the rule of God's love. The opposite of love is not hate, but, any guesses? Did a whole series on this. My teaching is really effective, I can tell. Fear. Perfect love drives out fear. Hate is a reaction or a symptom of fear. Opposite of love is fear. So when you begin to live in this, if you're not living in this way of life under the rule of God's love, your only other choice is this rule of law, this rule of proof that's driven by fear. The opposite of being accepted is what? This is probably more obvious than the other one. You can say it. Right, rejected. So you live between this tension of acceptance and rejection. And what happens is in between this tension is the way we express our acceptance is by affirmation. And so what ends up happening is if I'm not accepted, then I am rejected. And if you don't affirm, if you don't say yes, if you don't agree with me, you have done what? Rejected me. Do you see how the wheels come off so quick? This is why the wheels come off when you simply disagree or voice a question about what someone is suggesting or saying or thinking, or for someone doing the same thing to me. Because what happens is, and then what you do is you create this whole economy of harm that is basically says, if you don't accept everything that I think or say or believe or am or do, you have rejected me, you have harmed me. And then the wheels come off and there is no relationship. There is no relationship. All it is an arrangement of I'm going to agree or to accept whatever it is. And we never learn how to deal with this in ways that are healthy and whole and real and more importantly, formative, that actually transform us. Anybody who's ever done anything athletically and you had a coach or a trainer, your trainer or your coach did not agree with everything you do. They're always saying, no, do this. Hey, do that. Hey, have you tried this? What about this? No. And they make you do it again and again and again. You don't feel it as unloved. No, you actually say they see something in you. Their highest value for you is not to accept you wherever you are, but to help you become what you want to become. Remember, we talked about this last week. We are becoming, all of us, we are becoming. And so I want to add another, really this is more than this is more than an assumption. This is really a foundation. And so I'm going to just put this out there. You can take a picture of it. You can write this down. Then we're going to jump in and try to explain what we do about this. Over the next 2 weeks, it's going to take me 2 weeks to do this message. Today's on empathy, next week's on vulnerability, and these are going to be tied together very closely. So my foundation, my other assumption is that God's love is not only fully sufficient for human relationships, but the only foundation sufficient for the fullness of human expression. God's love is not only fully sufficient for human relationships, nothing else needs to be added. When I do weddings, the way I try to treat my own sort of circles, then my first posture is to find and to receive and to be loved by God and therein to posture myself to give that to another person. It is wholly sufficient for that. But more importantly, it's the only foundation sufficient for everything that God wants. It's the only one. I say it like this often, you've heard this before, that everything finds its meaning and its purpose within the context of its relationship to God. You will not find purpose. You'll toy at it, you'll tinker at it, you might drift towards it. You won't find the fullness of it without being reconciled to relationship, the relationship for which you have been created. That's my premise as a follower of Jesus, because I believe Jesus actually is who reconciles that relationship. That's the gospel, but that drives everything else. So last week we looked at this crazy passage in 1 Corinthians. This is what it talks about. Let us continue to celebrate this festival as brothers and sisters who are in Christ. Let us continue to live together under this banner, not with the old leaven. This is chapter 5, verse 8. Not with the old leaven. And then he differentiates this, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And you're going to see these two things. And what malice and evil, most of us go, well, I'm not malicious and I'm not evil. It's the way you would think about this is the trajectory. Every relationship, every conversation, every encounter, every connection has a trajectory. We talked about this in a series we did at the beginning of this year. It has a trajectory that we want to be people who take responsibility for that trajectory. You can predict how things are going. I deal with marriages, I deal with parents and kids, and I'm telling you, people sit in my office and they'll say one thing, they'll say another, I'll say, let me guess. This is what happens next, and this is what happens next, and here's the conversation. They're like, oh, how did you know? I said, well, the Lord told me. They're like, woo, right? It's like, no, it's predictable. It's completely predictable. It's completely predictable. There's a trajectory when you say things, when you have hidden intentions, when you hint at things, or you're passive aggressive, or whatever your, weapon of choice is. That's what he's talking about. We are no longer going to operate with this malice and envy, or malice and evil. It's the trajectory that leads to distance and destroyed relationships, but rather we're going to work with this unleavened bread, with this sense of purity, of sincerity and truth. These are about motive. These are about what you believe another person wants for you, what you actually want for another person. And listen, I will tell you, there have been times when I go into a conversation and my primary motive is to prove my point and to be right and to let a person know you do not mess with me. Have you ever felt like that before? And you have to let that motive get sorted out. That's evil, that's malicious. It has a trajectory. You have to let that motive get sorted out so that when you come in with sincerity and truth, what you want is for that relationship to be as healthy as it possibly can, and you want for that person to trust you. Every single time. Every single time. So this is how we learn this together. I want to read this. This is a longer passage. I've been looking at this for years and years and years and years and years. And this is kind of what the church is supposed to be. I think this is one of the opportunities we have as a church to be distinct. But Ephesians chapter 4 is this kind of famous, here's what the church is. It's got people's favorite passage in there, especially people who like to thump people over the head with the Bible. Speak the truth in love, blam. Like if that's your favorite passage, we probably need to talk. Because I can help you find some other ones that you might like better, or that you won't like better, that might be more helpful. We're going to talk more about that on week 4 of this series, that actual verse. But here's how it reads. Paul is writing to this group of people who are trying to figure out how to organize themselves to bring the image of God and his influence to bear on the world around them, to live out the way of life under the rule of God's love. And he says he organizes and he creates this ordering. And then he says, here's why I've created this ordering, verse 12, for the building up of the body of Christ. I want the body of Christ to be built up until we all attain the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, mature personhood. We become mature is the way this would read. To the measure of the stature of the fullness of Jesus Christ. In other words, until you fully bear the image of Jesus Christ, until I fully bear the image of Jesus Christ, and he has unhindered sway in every thought and every intention, every purpose of my life, we ain't done. I'm becoming that. You're becoming that. Some of us are further along than others, right? That's fair. But here's the other dirty little secret. Some of us are further along in certain points and then further behind in other points. You realize that maturity is not a one-size-fits-all. Sometimes you can be really mature in one area and really immature in others. And if you're married, you probably know this. Like, well, I didn't know you were like that. I'm growing. Because sometimes we're really mature in one area, but we've got some work to do in others. Until we all get this. This is the vision of this. And here's why. So don't act like children anymore. So we don't act like children. So we no longer tossed. And so we will no longer be children that are tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness, and by deceitful schemes. That we don't want to get sucked into all the madness that the world offers us. How good would that feel? If there was a place for just a moment, we could breathe and not just get sucked into everything that is going on everywhere. Then he says this, rather speaking the truth in love, we are to grow. Remember, we're to live with the sincerity, the unleavened sincere bread of sincerity and truth, the purity of sincerity and truth. So verse 15, rather speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way. We are to grow up. We are to become in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body is joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped. When each part is working properly, it makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. The reason I love this passage, it says that the body builds itself up. This doesn't mean that it does it independently of Christ, because he holds everything together and he organizes everything and he supplies and sources everything. But what it does mean is that we don't get built up without each other. You don't get to be built up into love without worrying or without concern for what's happening in the life of another person, the people that you know. Now the reality is, there are lots of people, and especially in a church like this, if any organization is bigger than like 20 people, you don't know everybody. So that's okay, that's not the point. But the point is to start doing it with the people that we do know, people that are around us, the relationships that we do have, to define them really well. He goes on and he keeps writing, and we'll pick back up in verse 19, and he says, what happens when we sort of buy into the ways of the world? He says, they have become callous, and they have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy, to practice every kind of impurity. But that is not the way that you learned Christ, assuming that you've heard about him and were taught in him as the truth is in Jesus Christ. To put off your old self, which belongs to this former manner of life and it's corrupt, through deceitful desires. I love that phrase because it means that I have lots of deep desires, and some of them can be very, very deceptive. It means we can want the wrong things. So to be very careful. I need people around me helping me to make sure that I'm not going off the rails or saying, oh yeah, I'm going to prove that we have to be careful in all these ways. Verse 23 says, and to be renewed in the spirit of your mind, to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and in holiness. To put on the new self. This is actually who you have become. Remember last week we said you are to be who you already are, to learn how to live out this likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. And then here's the kicker, verse 25. Therefore, because of all this, having put away all falsehood, let each of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Now, I want to remind you that speaking truth, is not spitting facts at people. Speaking truth requires you to see and to sense and to look and to be aware and to use that to frame the interaction, the connection. So that's what I want for us to look at, because he says this, let us each of you speak the truth to one another, to your neighbors. For we see ourselves, for we are members one of another. This is the connection that I'm talking about. Whether or not we learn to do this, or whether we're willing to lean in to do this and to embrace these connections, that's a choice that we're going to make, and we're going to kind of challenge that today. But by relationships, and this is how we define this, because it really matters how we see ourselves as belonging to one another. We will almost always default to demand to be understood. We will almost always default to demand that our way be seen and understood at the expense of our ability or capacity or willingness to understand another person. So I define relationships this way. Relationships are the way in which we see ourselves as connected to one another. The operative word is see. How do you see yourselves as connected to one another, to the people that are around you? How do you see yourselves? How do I see myself? The reason I called my friend who works in India was because I needed to see some things. I needed to be reminded, because it's easy. I remember years ago reading in the Bible, weep with those who weep. And you would see someone who showed us something, you go, whew, glad that's not me. And that's because I don't see myself as connected to them in a way that causes me. And in fairness, right, when you do what I do, somebody is always in a crisis, and you just can't carry that as a human being. So you have to learn other ways to navigate, to learn how to bear one another's burdens, to learn how to actually help shoulder this. This is where the body works together, serves together to do this. But when we talk about seeing one another, what we're talking about is what is the trajectory of those connections and what are you contributing to those connections? Community is this idea, and we're just, again, to give some definitions. Community is this idea that what we are after is, and we're going to talk more about this, I don't even know where to write this. I'm just going to put it over here in the corner so we can make some notes. That community is what we are longing for and looking for. And it's the relational space of these relationships where God's love, remember, it's the foundation, it's wholly sufficient, where God's love is exchanged, where I come in and my job is to offer the love that I've received that God has for me and to extend that to another person. And in doing so, in those spaces, in those places, we experience something that's a little bit different, that's a little bit freeing, and that brings a measure of fullness to it. And then ultimately, this is what gets seen in the world where people go, oh, those people seem to be different. And it's always, it's a moving target. It ebbs and it flows. Sometimes it happens beautifully and sometimes it's hard work. It's never perfect. It is never, ever, ever perfect. What happens to us is we get stuck in these places that are in between. And most of our relationships are stuck in these places that are in between, this pressure that we feel to demand that we be accepted, or this pressure we feel to prove ourselves as worthy of acceptance. I want to say that again. Most of us live in the space between trying to demand that people accept us, that somehow we are worthy, and I want you to see that. And so you end up demanding that people do that, or, because if you don't, you reject me, or we end up over here where we're just madly trying to prove to them that we are worthy of acceptance. And both of these are completely fragile foundations. What happens in this is you live in this sense of, we'll use blue, this will be fun, fragile relationships. That are ultimately driven by proof. Let me give you two more things when I thought about this. Demanded acceptance. I'll put a period there because I don't want to write the whole thing. Or demanded trust. What happens in this is we either have to perform at some acceptable standard to other people, or we have to end up pretending that we actually agree and accept for threat of rejection. And some of you, your relationships are marked by this. You know you can't say a word about this or that or the other, because if you do, you've harmed them immeasurably. We talked about this in a series. A lot of us put out eggshells. You walk in the room and go, oh, my hair looks so terrible. And what do you hope people will say to you? No, it's the best haircut I've ever seen in my life. And we're just throwing eggshells out. Because no one can say to you, yep, it is actually pretty terrible. I always love it. One of my friends always give her a hard time. I walked in one day and she said, you got a haircut, and like nothing else to it. I'm like, what does that even mean? You can't do that to somebody. So here's what's interesting. Think about this. You can't just observe it without saying like if it's good or bad. You got a new outfit. Think about this. This is what my quiet time is like. Demanded acceptance is pity. You know people who spend their whole lives trying to prove for everybody else how good they are. You don't admire it. You feel sorry for them. You feel sorry that that person feels like they have to work so hard to demand that other people accept them or approve of them. It's pity. Demanded trust is proof. Because we've never learned to sort of live on this foundation that is the only sufficient foundation for human flourishing, for human fullness. We live in a horribly broken world. A horribly broken world. Where if you learn or you try to live or you avail yourself to other people, you will be burned and you will be betrayed and people will take advantage of you. It will happen. If you're nice on the road, people are going to cut you off. I've just decided I'm not racing everybody. I'm driving a 1989 Volvo station wagon. I ain't racing anybody. My car likes 45 miles an hour, man. That's it. If it's faster than that, it ain't playing. But we've got this foundation. So I'm going to talk more about what we do because here's what we understand. The foundation for human fullness. This is the highest value for what I think God has created us to, and it's going to take 15 years to explain this. The highest value for human fullness is the love of God. If what I see and read and understand about the scriptures and eternity, and when we get to live in his love forever, that will be the fullness of human expression that we ever get to experience. We get it shadowed here. But it's the fullest expression for me to receive and to trust and to learn how to be loved by God allows me to live in the fullest expression of who I'm supposed to be. And the reason is the foundation of human fullness is the love of God because the expression of human fullness is the glory of God. For God's image, for his heart, for his love to be seen in the way you live or offer or give yourself in the world around you. In our context for today, in the people, the way you give yourself to the people around you. That people will see and they'll know. You've heard this. I think Maya Angelou said this, right? People will forget what you have said. They will never forget how you make them feel. It is very easy to make people feel stupid. It is very easy to make people feel belittled. It is very easy to put people in circles. People will forget what you have said, but they will always remember how you made them feel. Your kids will remember how you make them feel. Your coworkers, your employees, your boss, people will remember how you make them feel. This is such low-hanging fruit in our culture. What you're learning, and this is not about affirmation. This is about something else. This is about connection, trusted, formative connections. Do you know how few people live with people they can trust implicitly without having to prove themselves over and over and over again? How few people live like that? Do you have someone that you trust that they don't have to prove themselves? Some of you live in a relationship where it's constantly proving themselves because you don't trust one another. What we got to do is we've got to start figuring out how to get empathetic, how to learn how to do this. To see and to be seen. One of Stephen Covey's highly effective habits, you might be familiar with this, is he wrote a book years ago called The Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. One of the habits is to seek first to understand and to then be understood. I remember reading that in college. You know, what a novel idea. Because, dude, I come in wanting to be understood just like that. I come in wanting to be seen, wanting to be accepted, demanding that you understand me. That's where I come from most all the time by default. But what if we came in to see first? To see first. Not in order to calculate and then determine what we'll say and how it's going to be best read, but rather so we can continually build trusted, formative connections. We can first learn how to see, God, how have you loved me? And then how do I offer and exchange and create these places where there's trusted, formative connections that lead to this place where your love is exchanged and experienced, where people feel a sense of fullness and wholeness and hope from their interactions with me, from the relationship that they have with me. Years ago, we were in a leadership retreat, and everybody had their little task. You know how leadership retreats are, especially when you're the leader. It feels like you're just being blamed for everything, which is lots of fun. Which ultimately it was my fault, so it was okay. But they said, so I got this card, and on the card was written 3 words. And because what happens is someone will walk in, because I'm pretty quick, my brain runs pretty fast, it doesn't run fast well, it just runs fast. And I think out loud, which means there's a lot of chaos oftentimes when people ask me something. And so what I'm constantly having to tell people in the office when they'll ask me a question in the hallway, I'll stop and go, okay, I'm thinking out loud. And what that means is you're about to get chaos, and this is not a directive. So whatever I say cannot be held against me, nor can you use it as what Mike said. This is just Mike's thoughts. I'll think about it, then I'll come back and say, here's what I want us to do. So I learned that the hard way. But these 3 words I wrote down were really simple. It was listen, validate, and then I'll tell you in just a minute. Because what I would do is I would listen and then tell them what I think they ought to do. And it's fast. And oftentimes what people are doing, they're not necessarily looking for advice, they're looking for empathy. They're looking for, do you see me? If someone comes in and their default is, I need you to see me, I need to be understood, I'm demanding you understand me, and you don't do that, you dismiss them. It's interesting, the opposite of empathy is distance. The reason you live in distant relationships is because there's no empathy. So to listen is to see, to see. To listen is to suspend judgment. That is so hard. You know why? Because we are so good at judging things and people. We know exactly their motives for cutting us off. We know them exactly, right? We know this. They're a Steelers fan. They're a this. I'm just kidding. I like Steelers fans now. That's been replaced by other fans now. And we know exactly what kind of person they are. So we almost instinctively make judgments. So to listen isn't just to wait for them to stop talking so you can say what you want to say. To listen is to work to understand them. When people disagree with me, which happens more often than you might think, the first thing I want to do is to go, I make a living thinking about these things. And then I have to say, God, the work isn't listening often to that person. The work is often listening to God. God, what are you saying? What are you doing? What do I need to see here that I'm not seeing? What do I need to see that I'm not seeing? Do you know how natural that is for me? Not at all. I don't want to see what I'm not seeing. I want to see what I already see so I can tell you how to see like I'm already seeing. God, what am I not seeing? To listen, to validate. You are never, ever, ever wrong for validating what someone feels or senses or believes. You're not affirming that they're right. You're validating what you hear. When people say, Mike, I have a hard time believing in God, I'm like, I understand that. I completely understand it. Do you know why? Because sometimes it's hard for me too. I understand that. I know. When people say, Mike, I'm frustrated with this and the way the church is, I said, I understand that too, because it's also frustrating to me. I understand. When people are tired of this or tired of that or don't do this and they come, they want to avoid, I understand that. I understand that. God, what do you want us to see in this? That's the question. I understand how hard it is to navigate all the chaos that we have in our lives. I understand those things. But you recognize the emotion. You recognize what someone is feeling. Empathy literally means to feel with. And then what mine used to say is to listen, validate, respond. And I've changed it to listen. Here, I'll put it up there. I used to say listen, validate, and respond. And what I realize is oftentimes my response isn't super helpful. Instead, I listen, I validate, and then I try to figure out how can I build a trusted, formative connection. Sometimes your response isn't helpful, but your connection will always be. Empathy is not normal, nor is it natural to us. It has to be learned. I want to close our time, and I want to hear from a friend of mine named Javi. Javi's one of our pastors. And Javi works with a lot of our partners in our local missions, and he works in a lot of parts of our city that I don't run in very often. And Javi invited me to lunch one day, and he said, Mike, I want you to come and see. We went into a restaurant that I was unfamiliar with that spoke a language that I don't speak. I listened and I learned. We went to communities and grocery stores and met people that I don't run with in order to see and to experience and to feel what life is like in places that I don't necessarily live day in and day out. It's a tangible way to put your feet in someone else's shoes. And it's not to feel bad or to feel guilty. It's to see. For you and I to be able to see. So I want you to take a look at the screens as we get to see Javi's story.
Javi, I'm so excited to be with you right now and just be able to hear a little bit about your role and about Come and See. So tell us a little bit, what do you do here at the church?
Yeah, really excited to be here with you as well. So my role is I serve as a pastor of community engagement here at the church. I have the opportunity to really engage folks to go and serve outside of the building, but also like really to say, hey, how is it as a church that we can just kind of bring people along with us to see what's happening outside of the walls.
That's awesome. So you have some language called Come and See. So tell us a little bit about that.
It came from John 1, where before the Come and See, John the Baptist is with his disciples, and he sees Jesus, and he says to his disciples, behold the Lamb of the Lord. He completely stops everything that he's doing, and he focuses on Jesus, and he points others to Jesus. And then later on in a couple of passages past that, when the disciples ask Jesus, where will you be staying tonight? And Jesus responds by, come and see. And this beautiful invitation of coming and seeing, like he could tell him everything he's gonna do, but he doesn't. He withholds and says, you have to come and see it for yourself.
And that's why you want us to come and see. So Javi, one thing is that you lead with such humility, and you do show us what is out there and who is out there through such a lens of empathy, through really knowing people, seeing people, way more than seeing what's around. So what do you think are some misconceptions around empathy? I
think one of the misconceptions of empathy is that many of times we just don't want to step into what's difficult, right? We're very comfortable. And we really sometimes need a different lens to be seeing things through. So when we have a different perspective, it really changes. It really changes the way we see things differently. And those differences sometimes could be the way that we are brought up. You know, we all have different stories. And I think when we allow ourselves to enter into another story, I think that's where a lot of the beauty comes in.
When you start to experience.
Yes, when you start experience life through just entering into someone else's story and recognizing, oh wait, my story may be not so different, but it could be, you know. But when you enter into opportunities where you get to know somebody else's story and where they come from.
Yeah. So tell me, what's the difference that you see between empathy and sympathy?
So sympathy, many of the times what we want to do is like we want to try to fix things. So we want to sympathize with folks to say, hey, we can do it from a distance. We can do it from a distance, but to empathize is really to enter in and to be close with folks and to really walk alongside with them and build relationships through that.
Sure, and I think sometimes empathy can almost be a little daunting if we're honest, because you might see something and on some level it might hurt to enter in like you're talking about. So in your experience, what have you seen when people actually do kind of take that step and enter in to a hard place?
Yeah, and many times, I mean, it can be scary,
Yeah.
Entering into those things. But like, I think when you do enter in, you start really realizing the humanity of people, of like recognizing like, hey, many of the times folks don't have hope. And to come alongside someone and be with them, I think that really changes things because you're doing life with them as you're walking with them. So.
And something you just said is so hopeful, because we don't have to fix it. And we don't have to even have the right answers, right? So what would you say you want people to take away from this?
I think one of the things that we can take away from this is that we have an opportunity right beside us. It's many of times one person at a time. We don't have to overcomplicate things. It's right then and there, and where we could just meet one person and really, like we can meet a person this week and really engage into wanting to know somebody else's story.
So you're saying this week,
Yes.
just meet one person.
Yes.
And just get to know them?
Get to know them, get to know their story, get to know where they come from, get to know their families.
And I love that you oftentimes point us right to our very own backyards. Instead of seeing the world as this grand, big thing, you say, why don't you just look in your own scope? Whether it's coworkers or families, neighbors. And so maybe that's something we can all think about this week, is who has God put right here in front of us.
Thank you, Avi. So everyone is looking for a trusted, formative connection. How can you listen, validate, and connect with the people that you come in contact with every day this week? That's where we're going as we define these relationships under a new rule that allows us to live a little bit differently. Okay, let me pray for us, and then we will dismiss. Father, thank you so much for the people that you've put right in front of me, and I just want to project that prayer on everyone else, that you have put us in circles of influence. I ask for wisdom and for patience as we have to listen and hear from you, that we would learn to depend and trust that your love is the foundation for the way we live our lives. You just continue to form us into a fuller image of what you intend for us. And I thank you for that. I lift all the name of your son, Jesus, who is our King. Amen.